Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I have a comprehensive, as much as possible at least, masteries guide for MCOC. I will have a link to the spreadsheet in the description below, as well as a link to the Auntm.ai mastery builder site. This will allow you to just kind of like play around with your mastery points, determine how you want to allocate them without having to do it in game, in order to determine, necessarily the costs, how many Stony Mastery cores or Carbonanium cores or units, etc. you would need in order to unlock masteries, as well as gold, etc., as well as distributing the quantity of points you have in masteries, so that you're not like going to unlock masteries and then find out, oh no, I'm 3 mastery points shy of having the ideal points distribution I want. Because in order to do your mastery trees, you usually have to sacrifice somewhere in order to have points, say in like assassin, you might have to sacrifice attrition masteries, or if you want to run attrition, you're not going to be able to run despair, attrition, deep wounds, and assassin. You've got to have some pick and choose here. As far as masteries overall, I've split them into 3 categories myself, beyond just the offense, defense, and proficiency that is split in game. I have your standard masteries. These are masteries that pretty much all players run pretty much all the time. There are general exceptions here, but this is just like your core set. Virtually everyone runs these masteries. They're just really, really good to have. Next up, I have priority masteries. These are the masteries that pretty much define your mastery tree, because oftentimes you're choosing and picking and choosing between the different masteries. You're running a handful of some of them, and as a result, you're opting not to run a handful of the other ones. And then finally, I have notable masteries. These are masteries that people are known to run or have like inherent values for particular reasons, and I'll delve into that more so later on. And of course, some of these become more prioritized as a result of running different masteries or where you are in the game, like AQ or A War, etc. But they're definitely worth noting. Everything that doesn't fall in this list are masteries that I've essentially decided just weren't worth talking about. Like either they were incredibly straightforward and you're only ever running them if you're running like full offense or something for like long content, or they're just bad masteries and you don't want to run them, so they're not really worth talking about. That said, if you're someone who'd rather read, I'm pretty much going to be reading what I have here written down for you. So feel free to just read this spreadsheet instead, but I'll start with the standard masteries. So the first standard mastery is precision. This is located in the offense tree. A lot of people run 4 out of 5 points in here. I personally run 5 out of 5. It's just nice and neat and helps a little bit with the minor OCD tick. But the reason people run 4 out of 5 is that precision is essentially you have a more likelihood of critical hitting, overall a damage boost as a result. But because critical rating is not a flat raw increase in percentage chance to crit, this has degraded value. You get 80% of the raw number value, but not necessarily 80% chance increase to crit. So that 5th point actually has overall like degraded returns, being worth only 20%, and percentage going up. It's a little bit of a complicated math explanation, so I'll skip over it. Just know that if you want to be like totally efficient, 4 out of 5 is actually really, really common. If you don't want to think too hard about it, just run 5 out of 5. Super easy. There are exceptions for reasons why you wouldn't run precision, and that is going to be guaranteed crit champions who don't rely on critical rating in order to crit, like Ghost or Corvus Glaive, as well as non-crit champions who never crit, and you're not too worried about proccing those additional bonuses like Guardian or Guillotine 2099, who do get damage gains from critting instead, but you're not too worried about it and you'd rather distribute those points elsewhere, or non-interaction champions like Quake, who just never hit the opponent anyways, so you don't really care whether or not you're critting. Next up, we have cruelty. So in the offense category, typically you run 5 out of 5. This is essentially bigger damage on critical hit. And while this does have a degraded value, just kind of percentage-wise, because the raw number value of the damage you're doing is flat increasing, this is still worth running 5 out of 5. There's no actual like 4 out of 5 juggling here. You just run 5 out of 5. And again, there are exceptions like Guillotine 2099 or Crossbones or Quake if you're not concerned about the value in your cruelty or critical damage rating, but again, typically you just run all of the points anyways. Next up, for standard masteries, we have block proficiency. This is in the defense tree. I recommend you run 4 out of 4 points here. Essentially, block more damage, live long, and prosper. It's that easy. There are exceptions, and those are alternative opening champions, champions that don't rely on block or perfect block champions, such as Ghost or Elsa or Quake, or perfect block champions like Sunspot, where you know that you're mitigating all the damage anyways, so block proficiency doesn't help. Again, most of the time you just run 4 out of 4 here and take up that advantage, you know, even in the scenarios where it's not helping you. After that, we have parry. Parry is in the proficiency tree. I recommend you run 3 out of 3 points here. So while at 1 point you get the flat 1 second stun. So no matter how many points, you're getting a flat 1 second stun on a well-timed block. You get increased block damage reduction as well as increased stun duration based on perfect block chance with more points invested. The increased stun duration is nice for scenarios like Sunspot. But honestly, the best value and the reason you run 3 out of 3 here is the block damage is incredibly significant here, and it's just really, really worth running. Feel free to test it yourself. But let me tell you, it's definitely worth it because you just block so much more damage here, and because block damage is chip damage and you're already reducing a lot of it, when you're running 1 out of 3 in parry versus like 3 out of 3, like the quantity of chip damage you take can double or triple. And while it's still a small overall quantity of damage, just like that raw overall damage reduction is so massive, it's worth the extra points. Next up is dexterity. This is in the proficiency tree. You really only need 1 out of 3 points for this. This is turned on for the dex mechanic, the ability to dodge. You know, essentially your ability to dodge specials, etc., and take no damage when dashing backwards. There are exceptions where you will turn this mastery off for specific fights, such as Dormammu or Mojo, or maybe you happen to play Vulture, who has his own built-in dex mechanic built into the champion. You'll turn dexterity off because when you dex or dodge an ability, you will gain a precision buff, and that can actually work against you in situations like Dormammu or Mojo, causing you to degen, etc. As well as triggering like Mystic Dispersion in Alliance War. Next up is Stupefy. This is the last mastery in the standard category that I have listed here. And this is in the proficiency tree. I recommend you run 3 out of 3 or as many points as you can because essentially longer stuns, this works with parry. It's nice to have, especially if you're running Alliance War offense. This will help kind of mitigate some of the limber, allowing you to get that heavy attack in when you need to. There are exceptions, like if you know the opponent is going to be stun immune, or alternative opening champions that don't rely on the parry stun for a damage window, as well as finally also Abyss of Legends. If you don't want the opponent to be stunned for longer because you can't get damage on that stun window. Say you're trying to bait specials on Thing, or you're fighting up against Mordo, long stun durations can actually work to your disadvantage. So that's a situation where you might run less points in Stupefy despite the overall increased value. That's just worth noting. Next up, I'm going to talk about priority masteries. So these are the masteries that define your tree. Most often, you are sacrificing or opting not to take other masteries within this category in order to run other ones. So first up, I have Mystic Dispersion. This is in the proficiency tree. I recommend you run at least 3 out of 5, if not more. And the reason for that is scaling. So the first point gives you 2%, then it's 3%, then 5%, then 8%, then 12%. And if you look at it that way, it's just like, oh yeah, of course you want to run more points because you get more percentage power gain based on how high it goes. But what you actually need to look at is the difference in percentage gain per point. So the first point gives you 2% increased quantity. The second point has immediately degraded value at 1% increase. That third point brings you back to the normalized value of 2% increase. And then it's the fourth and fifth point that have increased values at a 3% and 4% increase. Because of this point distribution, it's better to be running it at least 3, if not 4/5. Yes, you could run 1 point and take only a 2% increase, but at 2% increased power every time you're nullifying buffs, it's just a small quantity of power. It's like almost not worth running. It's there, but it's not relevant. It doesn't feel substantial. So typically at the 3 marker is where you're actually seeing like a notable amount of power gain. And you actually see a really, really sizable chunk of power gain at 4,5 points. Essentially, this makes Nullify champions, Mystic champions, essentially gain crazy amounts of power and works really, really well. In a lot of scenarios, the Nullify champions are good because of this mastery. Look at Symbiote Supreme. namely Symbiote Supreme. Next up in Priority Masteries, we have Limber. This is in the proficiency tree. I recommend you run all the way up to 5 out of 5 as much as you can when you're trying to use it. It is primarily for war defense. That is the most frequent use. It's what makes Alliance War defenders more frustrating than your typical AI because you have a much shorter stun duration on parry. Additionally, it's really good in content like Abyss of Legends or General's Mistake content where you might get stunned because having a reduced stun timer can allow you to recover from being stunned should you get attacked at AOL or accidentally get stunned from like an arena duel, etc. It can be really, really good. A lot of people will run 1 out of 5. There's nothing wrong, but it's cheap, so sometimes you might find yourself turning it on. Or if you want to take war competitively, you really should be running out of 5 out of 5 just to make your defense ever so slightly harder. Next up is Liquid Courage. Liquid Courage and Double Edge I will lump together. These are the attrition masteries. So Liquid Courage is the poison version and Double Edge is the bleed version. I recommend you either run 0 points here and don't run either, or you run 3 out of 3 in both, or one or the other, depending on what your roster looks like. And the reason for that is for Liquid Courage, the damage that you take is 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 per point. Essentially, it scales up where that initial point is the highest cost of damage, but the second and third point have an ever slightly increase. As far as damage taken, but each point gives you a flat 10% increased damage, meaning that once you've paid the initial first price, the cost of health is reduced, but the cost of damage, the quantity of damage you're getting, remains the same. So it's best that you run as many points in this as it allows. Same with Double Edge. The damage you take is 10%, then 15, then 20. So the first point is a flat 10%, but the second and third is 5 plus 5% damage taken. So you're getting more attack for less damage taken overall in the form of poison and bleed respectively for these two masteries. So again, run them maxed if you're going to run them. These are best for arena grinding players or people who run full attrition friendly champions. It's best if you're running, poison or bleed immune, but it is worth noting that Liquid Courage, 3 points in willpower virtually negates the damage. As long as you are aware of the fact that like heal block, champions like Void can really, really burn you when you're running Liquid Courage. Any kind of heal block will totally screw you over. But otherwise, this could be considered free damage as long as you're running 3 out of 3 in willpower. For Double Edge, a lot of players will run 1 out of 3 in Coagulate, kind of like a related mastery, in order to get 100% damage resistance on champions like Omega Red. Sometimes people will run 3 out of 3 to mitigate the bleed damage as much as possible, but I don't think it's personally worth the extra 2 points. But if you really, really are trying to mitigate that damage as much as possible, you could run 3 out of 3 in Coagulate as well. We'll move on to willpower. So in willpower, I recommend you either run 1 out of 3 or 3 out of 3. And so this is for like kind of a majority of reasons. If you're just trying to get willpower and activate willpower for the benefit of healing when debuffed from masteries such as, or nodes such as long distance relationship, you can benefit from willpower just from 1 point. That will give you a really solid heal. You get most of the value from willpower from the initial point. The only real reason to run 3 out of 3 is to virtually mitigate Liquid Courage. So if you're not running Liquid Courage, you don't really need to run 3 out of 3 willpower. It's just not worth the extra 2 points, since points 2 and 3 have significantly decreased or degraded value in heal return rate. Next up is Despair. This is in the offense tree. I recommend you run up to 3 out of 3, whatever you can afford point-wise. This reduces the regeneration of opponents for each debuff on them. It is typically used to either mitigate healing. If you're using a champion like Iceman, where you're placing a ton of debuffs on the opponents, you could potentially mitigate the healing to 0 on the opponent. Or it's used to assist in making heal reversal trigger with less debuffs / trigger faster. Note that Despair will not trigger heal reversal. It will just aid in how quickly you can heal reverse opponents based on the quantity of debuffs you have active. Next up is Deep Wounds. This is in the offense tree. I recommend you run 3 out of 5, if not more points. While what this does is it increases the durations of your bleeds by 0.5 seconds per point invested. Longer duration bleeds means more damage from your bleeds. This has degrading returns despite being a flat 0.5 second increase per point. This is because while the damage per tick remains the same, the percentage increase in damage from this decreases as the duration of your bleeds lasts longer. Think of it like, oh, if you have a 10-second bleed, or it'd be easier to say, let's say you have a 5-second bleed. If you add half a second to a 5-second bleed, you've increased the damage of your bleed by 10%. But if you go from 5.5 seconds to 6 seconds, it is no longer a 10% increase. It now becomes a 0.89, something around there, give or take, increase instead, and so you're having degraded returns, and those degraded returns are still good to a degree, and they're better or more valuable when you have shorter duration bleeds like Nick Fury's light ending combos or Carnage's bleeds, where they're really, really short duration, so the ramp up in time has more value over a longer period of time. But the reason I recommend 3 out of 5 or more is at 3 out of 5 you actually see like a really significant increase in bleed damage, and this is a particularly expensive mastery, so a lot of people will run 3 or 4 points so they don't have to spend the extra cores unlocking that 5th point, but it is really nice to have 5 out of 5 if you can afford it / you have the extra points. Next up, we'll talk about Assassin in the offense tree. So Assassin as a mastery is really, really worth noting. You need to unlock Despair and Deep Wounds in order to unlock Assassin as well. I recommend you run up to 5 out of 5. This is best in fight scenarios where the opponent either has a very high quantity of health or you are expecting really frustrating last stands from the opponent, like Iron Man Infinity War is a really good example. Now, the reason I say this is because that if the fight is taken down in a one-shot, if you take the opponent from 100 to 0 in one single life, then you actually only have a 10.8% increased damage quantity over the course of the entire fight. So it's actually like not as good as a damage mastery unless you're getting a really long 18% health period where there's just a ton of health there that you're triggering off of, because it's still free damage. It's still a free overall fight total of 10.8% increased damage, 60% towards the 18% of course scaled, so it's still really, really nice to have. But don't look at this as a damage mastery, because over the course of the whole fight it doesn't actually add up as much as other masteries. For like minor comparison, this is 10.8%, and Glass Cannon, if you put 3 points in there, notably way cheaper to run, is a 7.2% increase. You're getting like 70% of the value in damage for way cheaper of an investment. But in really, really long fights, this is free damage and is really good to have. Additionally, you do get ability accuracy reduction and offensive ability accuracy increase if the opponent starts below a certain health threshold as well. Again, typically used in like Labyrinth of Legends, Abyss of Legends, the Collector or the Grandmaster, these kinds of fights where the low percentage health pool is still a really large amount of raw overall health. Next, I want to talk about recoil. I have to add it here. I will add the notes later. But recoil, you typically need to unlock in order to unlock Liquid Courage and Double Edge. I'm actually going to put it in the notable masteries. But recoil is a mastery that increases the quantity of special damage you do at the cost of losing health after the special has ended, in the form of 5, then 10, then 15%. And typically you only run out of 1 out of 3. This is arguably the worst part of running attrition masteries, but some people will run 3 out of 3 if they know they're only special 3ing, because you won't suffer from recoil if you're only throwing special 3s, or if you know the fight is going to end, or you're able to fully mitigate recoil, such as Ghost with Hood synergy, Corvus Glaive, where you're typically not dying from recoil because of glaive immunity, Captain Marvel movie, when you're indestructible, you don't suffer from recoil. These are scenarios where you would benefit from recoil without being punished, and I'll add those notes towards the end. Next, I'll talk about notable masteries. So notable masteries, the first one we have is Scouter Lens. This is in the proficiency tree. You really only need 1 out of 3 points here. Essentially, you scout the hero and star rating of a champion. One step away, used a third-party tool to determine who is on an unknown node in war. This is your way of getting around unknown nodes in war. If you're just jumping into those nodes and hoping you get lucky with your matchup, you're doing it wrong, or you're doing it the hard way rather, not necessarily the wrong way. This is really, really good to have. You can use the class-based Scouter Lens in order to narrow the list of champions, but for the most part, you should be okay with just the one in the generic. Next up is Petrify. This is in the proficiency tree. You either run 1 out of 3 or 3 out of 3. Typically, just 1 out of 3 is enough in order to open up the Pacify Mastery, but the benefit of this is while stunned, you reduce the regeneration / power gain rate of the opponent. It's useful to have, and it's a good budget mastery, but it's typically outclassed by other masteries very, very quickly, so it's not necessarily worth your time. It does have situational use advantage, but typically 1 out of 3 is fine. Pacify, also in the proficiency tree. If you're going to run it, I recommend you run 3 out of 3 because while stunned, the enemy's ability accuracy is reduced by 30%. This is most commonly used to let any champion counter Magic's Limbo. If you're only baiting Magic's Special 1, you always parry her before you push her to a bar of power. You can prevent the Limbo from triggering by reducing the ability accuracy to 0. Note that high sig magics can still trigger Limbo if you don't have additional ability accuracy reduction. It also has other situational uses like parrying Thing and hitting him while he's stunned and hoping that he doesn't gain rot stacks to kind of help your power gain management. There are other scenarios, but this is the primary one. Next up, we have Coagulate. This is in the defense tree. You either run 1 out of 3 or 3 out of 3 here. The 1 out of 3 is typically for the extra 10% damage reduction used to make Omega Red 100% bleed resistant. This also can be used to help mitigate the bleed damage from Double Edge, but if you've seen my guides to Attrition Masteries and Suicide Masteries, you'll know that the gains here are actually less than Willpower. So if you're trying to mitigate the damage and you're running both Liquid Courage and Double Edge because of the double debuff value there for Willpower, it's better to max out Willpower first, but if you're absolutely trying to reduce the bleed damage as much as possible, 3 out of 3 can be used here for equivalent gains across the board because it's 10% damage reduction per point, so you aren't having degraded returns here. Next up is Recovery. This is in the defense tree. You either are running 0 out of 3 or 3 out of 3 based on my recommendation, and that is because it increases the health recovered by a flat 5% per point invested. You use this to boost the champion's heal or use it in combination with Willpower to reduce the heal there to further mitigate the damage from Attrition Masteries. Typically, this mastery is used in conjunction with Attrition, while you could use it just for solo healing champions like Wolverine or Scarlet Witch, etc. I don't think it's worth the extra points or the point distribution if you're not running Attrition Masteries. Next up, we have Salve. This is in the defense tree. You run 1 out of 3 or 3 out of 3. So the 1 point is only really used if you're opening the path to recovery. I thought that was worth noting, but 3 points actually has a really very powerful usage here when you're running low star rating champions. Notably, variant 4 in the last 2 quests, when you are running 1 and 2 stars, this actually gives you a lot of passive healing because while the raw value of health per second is very low, the raw health total of your 1 and 2 stars is also very low. So this is a really solid overall heal that I highly, highly recommend you turn on if you're running variant 4. Next up is Collar Tech. Also in the defense tree. I have a question mark here for the quantity of points used because I don't see a lot of information on this mastery. I just know there are people who run it. Let's see. Yep. So I know there are people who run it. It's got situational uses that I thought were worth mentioning. If you have more information, please comment and let me know. Because like I said, I'm not too familiar with this one in particular. I couldn't really find it when I was researching it. So it has situational usage typically in war. It gives you kind of a advantage in power control management. And again, if you have more information than that, please let me know for a quantity of points or what the use case is. But it can be useful if you're using, say, Ghost to maybe have the upper hand on power bar management. Next up is Glass Cannon. This is in the offense tree. You can run up to 3 out of 3 points here. Essentially, you lose a percentage of your max health for an equivalent percentage attack increase. but because you are mostly hitting the opponent more and mitigating damage with the form of parries or dexterity, the damage return here is actually really, really good. Like, it sounds like, oh, it's an equivalent trade-off. You're losing health or max health for overall loss or gain in damage, but it's actually stacked in your favor because the damage, the scenarios where the increase in damage is benefiting you appears significantly more often than the scenarios where the missing health would have kept you alive. And because of that, it's actually really, really good to like 3 out of 3 this mastery. It's almost free damage, not quite. But it is also worth noting that it's not like the best mastery to have, but it's a really good placeholder mastery in my opinion. Also very, very good if you're running a full offensive mastery setup for content like Labyrinth of Legends or Abyss of Legends. Next up, we'll talk about Courage. This is in the offense tree. I recommend you either run 1 out of 3 if you're trying to be the most efficient and you're running this just like on a base mastery setup, or 3 out of 3 if you're running longer content. The reason for this is the first point is the most efficient. You get 10% increased attack on the first point. The second and third points, I believe, only give 5% increased attack. So you do get an overall 20% increased boost if you're doing 3 out of 3. And this is best if you're reviving champions or playing with low health pools. Percentage health pools, and is often maxed in long content / large static content pushes where you're using a lot of revives, but it's also good just as a 1 point off if you're ever expecting to drop below 50%, because 10% increased damage is a sizable chunk, and a 1 point investment here could be really, really convenient. Next up, we have Resonate. Resonate is in the defense tree. You really only need 1 out of 3 points in here. The reason for that is it has a 16% chance to proc if you invest 1 point, and it only goes up by 1% for each additional point you place in it. So, you know, at 3 out of 3 points, you're getting an 18% chance to proc versus 16% chance at 1 out of 3. Just stick to the 1 point. The extra 2% isn't worth it. Essentially, this places a weakness debuff on the opponent. This is really, really good for Alliance Quest Map 7, the What's Yours is Mine node, where you need to place a weakness debuff on the opponent in order to deal damage for the most part, but it also can be good if you have champions who benefit from placing debuffs on the opponent, like Void, Taskmaster, Electra, etc. But typically you just run this for the value in placing a weakness for that node. Next up is Stand Your Ground. This is in the defense tree. You either run 2 out of 5 or 5 out of 5. The reason you would run 2 out of 5 here is for the PI increase, if you want to increase the quantity of points you get from grinding Arena. The reason you run 5 out of 5 is if you want to run it for war defense. It's a 50% chance to resist heavy attacks when blocking. You could really piss off some players if you're running 5 out of 5 Stand Your Ground, they go to heavy or counter heavy, and then they get blocked or resist on the heavy. Can totally screw up their settings there and just totally get them annihilated. So yeah, it's good for that, but typically I think most people run 2 out of 5 here if they're running any points for the PI increase. Next up is Perfect Block. This is in the defense tree. You can run up to 4 out of 4 for the same reason of typically used for PI index for arena grinding. It is worth noting that there is a huge exception here because 4% Perfect Block is typically not a reliable source of Perfect Block, but Captain America, just generic Captain America, if he is max sigged with the Winter Soldier synergy for additional 5% Perfect Block, and this mastery maxed out, has access to 100% Perfect Block. Which is really, really worth noting if you're ever trying to maybe meme your way through content where you need to be blocking a lot, say the Act 6.2.6 champion boss. You could use Captain America to just block the champion's attacks. I have a video here I'm trying to highlight and showcase, but I need to get permission first, so if I haven't posted that video by now, it's because I haven't gotten permission yet. Next up is Extended and Enhanced Fury. These are in the offense tree. I really only recommend using extra points here, only really if you absolutely need a full aggression based offense build. It's good for full offense builds when you're running long content and you have champions with Fury buffs. Ghost, Aegon are kind of the notable ones here, but otherwise it's generally not worth the mastery point investment. Next up is Pierce. This is in the offense tree. You typically only run 1 out of 3 in order to access precision and cruelty, but the extra 2 points are still good value if you're running a full offense build, and is worth noting. Mutagenesis and Suture I've placed here. Both are in the offense tree. and the only time you really use them is if you're maxing both. And I hate that I have to put this here, but damn, Sweetia, when you crush it, you crush it. Because if you max both of these, it makes Rogue essentially bleed immune for Biohazard bleed. It's a really expensive way to make Rogue bleed immune, but hey, if you do it, it's really neat. You can then take Rogue and solo the Act 6.1.5 Crossbones boss. Way to go, Sweetia. You just break the game, mate. Break the game. So that is it. I'll add the notes here for Recoil after I close the video. That is my guide on all the masteries. If you're like, hey Jay, you're missing one of the masteries, it's because they've either added masteries, so they're not something I can talk about yet, or those masteries are garbage / are really only invested in if you're running something like full offense guide or something, and then you just run whatever the highest damage return rate is or highest defense return rate is, etc. However you need to distribute the points. That said, as always, hope you guys enjoyed. I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.